for it. Okay, so again, all of that was looking at, if we're concerned about our elections, our voter turnout, and again, we have the context of what softens the numbers, but again, the health of our democracy depends on turnout. We want to look at just what is the voting process and what inhibits people to vote. One, we looked at the basic qualifications, and they're not overwhelming, but there are some concerns with voter ID, and is that a barrier? But again, maybe a necessary one. In terms of registration, many of you have gone through this. So many of you are, even if you're not completely of the right age, could pre-register. I'll show you that in a second. And it often starts with well, how do I do this? For those of you who did, again, where are my hands? I think it's just Kai today and who else? So just two of you today. When you first decided I'm going to register, did you know where to go? So you went to town hall kind of instinctively, right? That's the kind of center of our government in Georgetown. I'm going to go there and ask somebody. And they gave you a form? Yeah. Did you go to the right office initially? Just kind of, yeah. It's like there's just the clerk's office over there. But, if it was like Newburyport or another one, there's multiple doors. You maybe gone in the assessor's office and realized that's for taxes. What did you do?
I just went online.
You went online. Did you just type in register to vote?
Yeah.
And do you remember what site you went to first?
No.
Okay, so kind of a blind search and a kind of a blind walk in a building. You both kind of started with the right thing, though, right? Building, internet, okay? And it ultimately will lead you there. But it does take this kind of conscious effort in terms of your time. You had to kind of get there and a thought process, right? So it does take time and effort, and it isn't immediately, it's not like this intuitive thing. You've been told since day, whenever you started dreaming about driving, that you go to the RMV, right? You go to the Registry and Department of Motor Vehicles, and that's how the process starts. And, you have some understanding of that. I don't know if we do as much to kind of tell kids from day one, this is what you need to do when you register to vote. Many of you, maybe you're going to find this in an election, could have registered to vote and voted in a particular election, but you thought of it too late. In many states, registering to vote is something you have to do well in advance of elections, and in many cases, multiple weeks in front of elections. By the way, I'm going to show you again how to register, and one of the things you might want to think about as you register is, do you want to do party affiliation? Massachusetts has semi-closed primaries, and what that means is, if you register Democrat, you have to vote. You don't have to vote, but if you are going to vote, you vote in the Democratic primary. If you register Republican, you vote in the Republican primary. If you register as independent, you could choose. And that's kind of an interesting thing to do in Massachusetts. Because what you can do is kind of crossover rating. You can feel like a pirate. You can go in the voting booths and yell, "Arr, mateys," and then kind of, loot and pillage, right? What it means is, if you're a Democrat and you realize that Massachusetts will go Democratic, historically, then maybe you vote in the Republican primary to either pick the worst candidate and set them up for failure, or pick what you think is the best candidate for them. Conversely, as a Republican who feels like, hey, I'm never going to swing the state, same strategy. Let me go sabotage the Democrats. Or if, I really am going to be saddled with the Democrat, let me pick the one that's least objectionable. So there's a way to kind of, look at your political reality and kind of think about what you most want to do. Do you most want to kind of affirm where your party is leaning, or do you want to try to skew in a honest and integral way, or in a kind of malicious way, the other party? Because I think both do play out. I think there is an idea of, look, the other party is going to dominate, and if I'm going to have a say, I'd like to kind of skew them more conservative, or skew the other side more liberal, right? So do think about that. This registration too is not necessarily one time. If you move, and there's some studies that say, there it is, the average American moves every 5 years. You guys in particular, when you go off to college, you could continue to vote locally through an absentee ballot. You could decide that eventually I'm going to establish residency where I'm going and I'll vote there. But once you get out of college, you're going to jump around a lot. You'll move a lot. And even if it's within Boston, even if it's within town, You might move from in Georgetown, District 1 to District 2, and then it's a whole re-registration, right? And that, again, starts that whole process over again. So one of the things we tried to do to make it all simpler is something called the Motor Voter Law. And this happened in 1993, more formally the National Voter Registration Act, but that doesn't have the nice ring to it. Motor Voter Law, right? What it said is, Kai got up and he said, I'm going to go register to vote. I guess I'll go down to town hall and kind of, look around there. And Haley, you similarly fumbled around the internet. Where do you guys know to go for, to begin to become an adult and get your license and drive? Well, that's the Registry of Motor Vehicles, the Department of Motor Vehicles. That's the one governmental agency that almost everybody knows and they go to. So why don't we put the forms there? Why don't we allow people to begin to register to vote within the DMV, the RMV? And similarly, where do other people kind of continually access government? Well, that's through governmental service offices, whether it's a disability office, a public assistance office. Let's make it available through there. Let's make it available through the mail. We're a democratic society. If people, want this form, and this is, again, we're in 1990s. The internet is beginning to really kind of develop, but it's not as prevalent. And people still use the mail. People showed up at your house with shorts, and they took a letter across the world for you for, at that point, like 29 cents. Pretty cool service. But now we're able to do it increasingly online, and that's why you were eventually able to find that site. Now, what's interesting is, again, everything gets politicized. So you would think, okay, this is good. We're giving people increased help, access to registering, and therefore voting. But this became, like I said, politicized. So, the argument just on the surface is the old method was kind of confusing and cumbersome, and it was a barrier to voting. What opponents are going to say is you are now making the states do your work for you, and you're not funding them. And this is an unfunded mandate. So that's just kind of on the surface, the pros and cons. But if you dig down politically, who are the ones that know how to register? Who are the ones that struggle? Is there a socioeconomics to this? And if there's a socioeconomics to this, is there then kind of race and other factors that correlate? Republicans criticized this on some level because they felt like the Democrats would use this to their advantage to get more of their base registered, and therefore this would unfairly benefit the Democrats. Because this is their constituency, they felt. What's interesting is it led to, I believe it's 11 million new voters, registered voters, and in the end, the turnout didn't change. And in the end, what you saw is actually it benefited more the Republicans. But there was that battle. Oh, there's my numbers. 11 million new voters. It actually resulted in the next election cycle of a 5% decline. USA, we're number one. They registered. They didn't show up. And all this effort to get more people to the polls, initially resulted in a 5% decline. And you actually had more Republicans registered than Democrats. So a lot of false hopes and a lot of false fears as a result of this. But what you see is continued efforts by the government to kind of reach out to you. So you might have, I don't know if everybody still goes to the mall. That's a thing for teens. But sometimes you have like the League of Women Voters show up there. Sometimes they show up at schools. They just try to find public forums where people go through and get you registered. Some states move to like same-day registration, that you're only aware of elections when it's imminent and it might be too late. Why do we have this, lengthy period between registration and voting? Do we really need it from an administrative standpoint? Now, one of the sites that you might eventually got to, and I'm going to email this to you, there's our Secretary of State for Massachusetts, is how to register to vote. And in our state, it's 20 days prior. And you're going to see on some level, easy, I go online. And I just need my driver's license, and it used to be your social security number, but now it's a driver ID. You've got this kind of number there, and that's all I need. I'm gonna tell them who I am and my address, and I'll plug in that number. Well, again, you are in the majority, but there is 10% of American publics do not have that driver's ID. And again, it skews for who is low income and it correlates to race and other factors, right? So this may not be a complete option. Plus, it assumes that you have, and I do believe that, I'd have to see a survey, but not having a computer or a smartphone may be increasingly rare, but it's not universal, right? Not everybody has that. So perhaps you want to do it by mail, but then I got to download things. I got to download the form. Well, that requires, again, computers, internet access, printers, expensive ink. I throw the printer out now, essentially. The printer, half the time, if it comes with ink, that's a better buy than going to get the ink, right? Or you could do it in person. Well, that involves, again, accessing, you need to go by car, by public transportation. You need to figure out what building it is. If it's Georgetown, it's easy. If it's Boston, maybe it's a little more confusing. And you got to find those places, right? So when you show up in person, you need identification on some level in Massachusetts, right? It could be the driver's license. It could be some other state-issued ID card. It could be a utility bill showing that, here's my name, here's my address, and it came from the power company. Or, anything else that might correlate with, who you are and where you live. Again, not insurmountable, but on some level a barrier. Maybe if you showed up and didn't realize it involves at least a second trip, and the heck with that. I'm not voting. If you do eventually get to go online, I'm registered, okay, but I went and did this again just to kind of get to this screen. I had to plug in my number. Look, I blacked it out. I don't want any of you guys, taking on my identity and signing me up for things. My favorite, we did an interest group project, and students had to kind of research interest groups, and someone signed me up for AARP way too early. I started getting mailings because they signed in as me. So then I had to black that out. But that's what the form's going to look like when you guys sign on. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, because you can now do it online, a lot of interest groups, and by online what I mean is you can essentially request the form. You're going to eventually need to fill out this form, and all the interest group sites will eventually lead you there. But interest groups will also hook you up with that. So here's the NRA, and I liked it because it's got Chuck Norris there and you trigger the vote, right? I like the analogies there. But this is one of the ways, like you go to your Sierra Club or you go to your NRA, and they'll get you to sign up, and then it's the pluralist theory, right? Sierra Club, NRA, they're save the animals, shoot the animals. They cancel each other, right? Okay, I registered to vote, and now it comes time to vote. Where do I vote? You guys knew, right? Or did you initially go, where do I go? And
Well, I voted in Haverhill, so I was
Oh,
a little bit confused.
You're a little confused. Okay, so that's a great example.
Yeah.
Because tons of places to
Yeah.
vote there. Do you remember how you found out? Did you just ask your folks? Or
Yeah, I just asked
Yeah.
my friends.
It involves often a kind of a phone call or an internet search. Where do I go to vote? Because again, it's not like there's a chip in your head that tells you where to vote. You knew where to go, right? Did you know which line to get in? Or did you give me their address and they said, go over here? Yeah, right? You guys had an advantage because it happened on a school holiday for you, right? I was here, I was at work. So I had to work it in around work. So typically the polls are open 8 to 7. You throw in those hours and a little bit of rain, and that's enough for people to go, the heck with this. A little bit of snow, that's too much to overcome. So again, to make it more accessible, you see things like early voting. Massachusetts did that. I'm not kidding you when I said I walked in to pay my water bill and then realized, hey, I can early vote. Why not do it now? I don't want to work it around my other work day. I'm here. And that certainly made it easy. If you want an absentee ballot, you usually have to provide some sort of reason as to why, like where are you going to be and why can't you vote on the day of. A lot of states have said you don't have to give a reason. That's what they mean by no excuse. You don't have to kind of make something up. Why not expand the polling places? Make them in other kind of, you walk into the grocery store, I need broccoli, and hey, I think I'll vote. And again, I suppose I have some concerns with that because it ought to be on some level a conscious and deliberate act that you are willing to go, I don't want to say, through a hardship, but that you take seriously and that you're willing to kind of exert effort, right? So if we can look at those and think of those as kind of, these are the barriers, what you would see is with some of these reforms that we've largely we've expanded the right to vote. We have given people increased access to registering and voting. And yet what we perpetually see is kind of a turnout rate that stays the same, and is in an area that maybe we have concerns about. So what is the problem with voting? Well, mostly it's probably psychological, to be honest with you. You can look at all the logistics you want, and what it really comes down to is people's kind of attitudes and beliefs about voting. Some people only vote when they're ticked off. They vote for disapproval, and when they don't vote, it's a sign, hey, maybe things are okay. Some people don't vote because it's the opposite. They don't feel good about government at all. They're disconnected, and some don't understand the importance. My point that I want to end on, and I'm actually in a good spot to kind of transition, my point I want to end on is if you want to increase voting rates, maybe you need to look at the psychology of voting, why people don't vote, not the logistics of voting, right? So that's my transition. Good.
Report cards are ready to be handed out, and they are in your mailbox. High school C block teachers, please come down and get your report cards to hand out during the last block, C block.